Everyone, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started here. My name is Amy Swinmaker, and I will be moderating this session along with fellow board member Adrian Artwong down there. And this is making your program accessible to and inclusive of instructors with disabilities with Dr. Sheryl Burgstahler. If you have any questions, you can put them in the Zoom chat, and the speaker will get around to them at the end of the session. The session is being recorded, as you probably just heard, and it will be on our conference website once we're done captioning it. Speaker slides are also on our conference website, and it's like Adrian just posted them in the chat. Finally, I want to say thank you to our sponsor, HonorLock, for helping us make this conference possible. If you want to chat with them about online proctoring, you can head over to their channel in our conference Slack, which is also in the chat. Now I'll hand it over to our speaker.
Okay, thank you very much. What I'm going to talk about today is making your program accessible to and inclusive of instructors who have disabilities. Some of you know that I like to talk about making your courses accessible and really focus mainly on students with disabilities. But today we're thinking about this a little bit differently, thinking about a whole program. I'm going to kind of be thinking about an online program, a centralized online program, but it could be a department or even a small school, the whole school, kind of an organization level, thinking about making it accessible, and then specifically to employees, including instructors who have disabilities. We don't have as many role models as we need people with disabilities in high-level positions, and that's certainly true of online learning. And part of that is because they're not always very accessible, the learning management systems, to faculty members who have disability. It's something we work a lot on at the University of Washington, actually. And we have someone on our staff, I probably will mention again, but his name's Hadi, and he's blind, and he works on a lot of user interface type things. And so he is a good tester, but also he is a power user of his screen reader. So his experience is not always the same as other people who are blind. Surprise, surprise, because they may not be able to look under the hood the way he does and see how things are presented on the screen, even though he can't see them on the screen. And so he's aware of this too. So he tries to overcome that burden to be more of the average blind person using a computer. But anyway, so I'm happy to talk about this topic. I come from the University of Washington, and I have my email address right on the screen here. I'll read it in a second, but that's an invitation. If you want to talk about this a little bit more or send a resource to me that I hadn't thought of or whatever, then just feel free to do that. My email address is sheryl@uw.edu. So let's get started. Who am I? Well, I'm from the University of Washington, here in Seattle, beautiful sunny day in October, which we're pretty happy about that until we think, is this global warming? So anyway, we're all in that same boat, but we're trying to just enjoy it for what it is right now. So I direct Accessible Technology Services, which has 2 units, the IT accessibility team, which started in 1984. And I actually started that. That's the year I came to the university. I think I must have been a teenager or something. I was quite young. And it's funded by the University of Washington. In the IT accessibility team, we make sure that whatever technology we procure, develop, and use at the university is accessible to people with disabilities. That includes students, faculty, other employees, and visitors. And when you think about our websites, for example, to make sure that they're accessible to someone with a disability accessing those websites. And again, funded by the University of Washington. But back in 1992, I decided I wanted to branch out a little bit and think of strategies working with people with disabilities to help them be more successful, but that actually goes beyond technology. Because technology in and of itself doesn't increase the employment and academic prospects for a person with disability. There's always a context. And so I started the Do It Center, Disabilities, Opportunities, Internetworking, and Technology, so I could focus on those things using grant funds. And so that's funded with external funds to the university, although they provide a very friendly home here for us and give space for that particular part of my organization as well, because it actually benefits the University of Washington too, in ways that we wouldn't be able to accomplish using our IT accessibility team. So that started in '92. It's supported by federal grants primarily. National Science Foundation would be the biggest one. And then we started a Do It Japan program in 2007. So at the University of Tokyo, there is another program there. And they, like our programs here, work with teenagers with disabilities, helping them get ready for college and then on to careers, getting access to technology, and so forth. But also institutions, working with technology companies to make their products more accessible. But disability services providers to maybe encourage students with disabilities to get into technology fields and so forth. And then we also have been funded since 1999 to support the Center for the Universal Design in higher education, in education. And a lot of that is devoted to higher education. There are many resources relevant to online learning as well. So let's get started here. I'm going to tell you about the project that's really funding my presentation, something like this, when we're talking about faculty particularly. It's under an AccessADVANCE initiative. That was funded by the National Science Foundation as a big initiative for advanced programs. All of the advanced programs, it's been around for a long time, deal in some way with increasing the participation of women in technology fields, actually academic positions in STEM fields, more generally science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And ours has been the first project funded to focus on women with disabilities and increasing their success as faculty members in STEM fields at post-secondary schools. So like a lot of our projects, we really zero in on sometimes a narrow group, and we try to make sure that that group is well supported, and so that people coming into that field who have disabilities have an easier time, if that's necessary, to be in those fields. And so for institutions and programs and organizations, we're implementing systemic change. So people with disabilities in academic positions are welcome and fully included and can achieve success. So much of what I'm presenting today came from some research we did as part of this project. And then for the whole community, developing resources regarding institutional practices to increase the successful participation of, guess what, women with disabilities in academic STEM careers. And for that second part, we're working primarily with these other hundreds of advanced programs. And we have an online community and helping them, for example, when they're working with women in academic careers, or those that are trying to become successful in academic careers, then we help them figure out how they might recruit maybe some women with disabilities that might participate in what they're doing. And we help them make their programs more accessible to women with disabilities, just kind of talking about things that I'm talking about today. So we'll talk a little bit about the experiences of faculty members with disabilities and the access approaches, accommodations, and universal design as two approaches. The first one being reactive and requires a request. The second, universal design, being proactive, and that we design systems to be more inclusive. And that's the basic approach AccessADVANCE takes. And then we'll share some recommendations that we developed by a lot of coordination with people in the advanced program, but a lot including women with disabilities that we surveyed or had conversations with to see what things would help them be more successful. And then we have, I'm giving an example of the universal design of meetings and events that you do in any program actually, but how you could apply a universal design in that case, and then resources at the end. So examples of access issues for women with disabilities. What we found actually in all of this discussion that we had before we came up with recommendations is there isn't a lot of difference between women and men who have disabilities. Women have a double minoritized group status, women with disabilities, and so that has to be taken into account. But other than that, they're much the same. So access issues include disability-related issues that impact productivity. And so maybe they're not as fast at getting something done. And some of the suggestions in there are things like giving a longer time or telling about what they need to do earlier, and so they can take a longer time. Challenges in attending conferences is a big thing, particularly for people who have visual impairments and mobility impairments. So the disabilities are more apparent rather than disabilities like being part of a neurodiverse atypical group or learning disabilities and things like that. And some of the challenges include having permission to take an assistant with you. Some schools will not provide any extra support for that. Some will provide the assistance of salary and travel expenses for that person. And some have a compromise somewhere in the middle that will pay for his or her travel expenses, but not the other expenses that might be going with the trip. So that's something that comes up quite often. And when you think about it, academic positions, there's a lot of travel, a lot of networking, and a lot of things go on at those meetings that you really need to be at, especially early in your career. So inaccessible online tools related to HR to even apply for a job, and benefits and all those, once you are hired, all those websites you need to go to support you as an employee. And then inaccessible tools used for meetings and collaboration and online learning. I have to say that Canvas and Blackboard and most of those large learning management systems are relatively accessible to Hadi and others, people with mobility impairments and so forth. That's kind of the good news, but there are a lot of tools that are not. Uncaptioned videos, inaccessible meetings, inaccessible grant portals, many of the journal articles that they need to submit their papers to require that the papers be turned in a PDF format, and that's difficult to do for some individuals with disabilities. So it requires the assistance of another person to help them do that. Review processes, like if you review other people's papers, and then if they have to turn them in an inaccessible format to you, then what happens? And what I hear from faculty often that have disabilities is well, they get waived from that responsibility. Well, that's not exactly what people with disabilities want to do. They want to be fully a part of what everybody's doing, and they do want to have input on people that are being hired. And so that can be a pretty expensive accommodation to take all of those papers that are being reviewed, or a person's hiring a person, faculty position, to review all of the documents that they have submitted and have them all remediated in order for them to have access. And that's the thing that comes across in all of these discussions we've had, that there's just a lot of fuss around accommodating them. And that can give the impression to their colleagues that they're kind of expensive, sort of a bother, you know. And so that's not the impression you want to be giving anybody in your organization when you're, particularly as a new faculty member. And then concerns in requesting accommodations. Many times, like in the faculty manuals or whatever, there's no mention of how to request a disability accommodation. Also in the interview process, no request for no information about requesting accommodation. Hadi, I already mentioned him. It's a good example. Kind of embarrassing for me because I actually knew Hadi. I encouraged him to apply for a job we had open, and he tried to apply for it. The process wasn't accessible to him. The documents, the forms he had to fill out were not accessible to a person who's blind. So we provided an accommodation. We made sure that he could get through that whole process. But again, it was pretty embarrassing. So once we hired him, I said, Hadi, okay, it's going to be your job, part of your job, to work with HR to fix those systems so they're more accessible. But anyway, all those things can end up to be barriers that other people don't have to face. So with an accommodations-focused approach, which most of our campuses have in hiring and for employees once they're hired, is that they adjust us an existing product or environment for a specific person. So not giving a lot of thought ahead of time of whether they're accessible to a person with a disability, but just rushing around once a person with a disability applies for a job. And people do pay attention to disability, to how accessible your programs are when they apply as well. We just had a kind of a heartbreaking outcome it was in our applied math department where someone was applying for a job, and she was actually a wheelchair user, and they selected her. She was the best candidate, and she turned down that job, which doesn't happen for the University of Washington often. We're a good school, and we're in Seattle, which is considered a very pleasant place to live. And so they came to me. That's how I learned about this, and said, what can we do for the future? We didn't want this to happen, and so forth. Well, and they live they have their department in an old building. But I did come up with some things they could do that would make that building, and particularly the most important activities, accessible to a student and to a faculty member or employee with a disability. So some things can be done to improve accessibility. We don't have to throw our hands up if the building's not very accessible. We can't do anything about that. In their case, for instance, the main entrance had about 5-6 steps. But around the back was an entrance as well. And it was very accessible. And even from the front, there's actually a ramp that goes down to the back, but they never publicized that. And so I gave them some suggestions to make that back door look a little more like a main entrance, not restricting the entrance with the steps, by the way, but having a sign pointing to the accessible entrance. But then the biggest thing I had to do actually is they had their garbage bins down there. And so if you just put them a little bit over from this entrance, and maybe even put a little divider there, then you at least feel welcome getting in on that floor. But anyway, so that's an accommodation, though, when we adjust the environments for a specific person. But that will be remediating inaccessible information for accessible documents to make them more accessible, and arranging for sign language interpreters, captioning videos. Sometimes our videos are captioned by a computer, like for YouTube. They're not really accurate. And so we need to make sure that we get in there and edit those videos so they are accurate. Okay, so our practices in AccessADVANCE embrace a few things. Variations in ability as a normal part of the human experience. If you just think about, well, disability, ability, levels of ability, that's a normal part of the experience. Just like you'd think about a variation in height. And there's some people very short and some people very tall. But you don't think that they're abnormal just because they're on one end or the other. Thanks to that for my husband and I, because I'm 5 feet and he's 6'5". And so I wouldn't think of us being, I would think of us would be normal as human beings, but maybe, on the ends of the normal curve as far as our height. And intersectionality. And that basically means that a person with a disability is going to be impacted by other identities they have. A person with a disability who is a woman might have a different experience than a man having that same type of disability, or intersectionality with respect to just even where they went to school. Those with a learning disability who went to a school that had a lot of really good services and early diagnosis for people with learning disabilities may have an advantage over someone who wasn't from a school like that. And so we need to think about these other identities that'll impact their success, whatever they're doing. And then thinking of disability as a form of diversity. I regularly give talks these days on diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI initiatives, going to a lot of conferences online that I normally don't go to. And I kind of spread the word that disability should be considered in those DEI initiatives, which is actually a new idea to a lot of people that come to my talk. So, but if you really think that it's a normal part of the human experience, we certainly can take that group of people with disabilities and consider them a marginalized group. But also it's important, whatever groups you're reaching out in diversity efforts, like let's say racial ethnic minorities, that you fully include racial ethnic minorities who also have a disability. And so it needs to be in there somewhere, but in DEI initiatives. And then social models of disability. I talked about the accommodation process. That's kind of a medical model where we just, go about our business, design things, whatever. And then if a person comes along who has a disability, we kind of like, well, it's their problem. They have this disability, but we're really nice people. And so tell us what you need and we'll try to make that work. That's the medical model. Social models are, you look first to the environment. We're designing a course, a building. How can we make this online course, for example, reasonably accessible? Some of the things we can do, like have captioned videos, like have documents in accessible format and so forth. Let's do that. Make our modular system very easy to follow, making our assignments really well described. And I teach online at City University of New York, and I really am set on making my descriptions of the assignments really good. But often I'll still get a question from someone. And so all that for me means that I'm going to look back at that, listen to that person and why they're confused, not just answer their question, but why it's confusing, because I want to know, because I might be able to reword it a little bit and it might help some other people as well. And so that is the social model of disability when you look at the product you're creating and try to make it inclusive from the get-go, born accessible. And then proactive and universal design are ways to respond to the social model of disability by working on accessibility. So we're looking at a paradigm shift. And when I think about departments or programs in this talk, we want to go from being reactive to be more proactive of whatever we're creating. How can we do that? go from the design for just the average instructor to design for every potential instructor that includes those who might have a disability. You might not have any in your program right now, but might as well get prepared. That's that proactive universal design approach to things. You may not do some things until you have a person that needs an accommodation, but you can at least be prepared to have thought about it. So we just use the regular old standard definition of universal design as the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. If you notice, this doesn't mention disability. It's a definition that applies to all abilities, but other characteristics. And so you can use this as a framework for your DEI efforts, because you could also, during this process, consider issues related to race and ethnicity and gender identity, and so forth. So there are 3 sets of principles that underpin all aspects of instruction and employment. I'm not going to go through those, but I'll just mention them. There are 7 principles of universal design for your basic physical presence, and it also provides general guidance to any application of universal design. And then there are 3 for universal design for learning. Many of you have heard of that, sometimes from me. That gives you extra hints for how you can make your online courses more inclusive. But then your IT is covered by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and there are 4 principles that underpin that. Between the 3 of these sets, then, you have enough principles and guidelines and whatever out there. So we're going to skip over all that, but give a summary of what that means in terms of an educational institution. That we provide multiple ways for people to learn. That can be on a website with some information about HR procedures or something. It doesn't have to be in a course, since we're talking about our program here. And then demonstrate what you've learned and engage. So different ways to communicate, email, Zoom, so forth. On my syllabus, in the class I'm teaching right now, it says, if you'd like to meet with me one-on-one, just let me know. We can find a mutually agreeable time. But then also decide how you want to meet. Could be by email, could be by Skype, Zoom. I like Zoom best. But in this case, I figure it's more important to them. They're the student. And so they should let me know how they want to meet. And then ensure all the technologies and facilities and services, resources, and strategies are accessible to people with a wide variety of disabilities. So that's that accessibility part. So considerations are recruitment, as I mentioned with Hadi, recruiting and that job description that goes out there. It should be clear, and even could potentially mention in the requirements for a job that the materials and programs that you offer are accessible, and that you value accessibility experience. So if you have an instructor that's applying for a job in your program, they would have an opportunity to share that they have experience in accessible design, like Hadi. So that would be valued. Having experience in accessibility would be truly valued for the job, and that could be in any job. We proposed that all IT jobs here at the University of Washington, that a statement like that appears, not under the requirements, but probably like the additional preferred, knowledge and skills. And that way it's not going to rule anybody out, but it might give benefit to some people that have that experience, which since we're all trying to make our websites accessible and so forth, then it does, there is an advantage of people who have a disability or have experience with a disability through someone in their family or whatever. But anyway, kind of getting that in there in the recruitment process. In the hiring process, once you get to the point where you evaluate and decide that this small pool of people you're going to interview, then when you set out the notice that we would like to interview for you for this position, it's important there to include the statement on how they can request accommodations in the interview process, which might be different than the accommodations they would ultimately need on the job. You shouldn't ask them that question, by the way, at that point. They need to convince you that they can do the job just like anybody else who applies. And you shouldn't be asking what would be considered to be too personal. Years ago, in my generation, they often asked how old you were. And if you're in those childbearing years, it could really be a big disadvantage. And asking things like about your family plans was perfectly acceptable back in those days, but not now, of course. Well, now it's disability as well. So, so the person could ask for accommodations during the interview process, and then after they get hired, then telling them how to request accommodations, not individually. It should just be in whatever you're sharing with everybody, because by that time you don't know if this person has. Well, you may know if they have a disability. It might be obvious, but you don't know about the rest of them. They might have a disability as well, and they're not required to disclose that to you. And it's not, and many will, by the way. But as I talk with students with disabilities, that's an option for you. And some people think it's an advantage for you. So whatever decision you want to make, but it's not something that you need to share with the person that interviewed you or potential employer. And so it might not be shared. And what you have to do is, as an employee, as someone applying for that job, is you have to convince your potential boss that you can do the job. And so you can't lie about things, not pretending you can do it, but anyway, you may not know. So there in the faculty got manuals and so forth. The guide for faculty in your program or your department should include disability related accommodations, and just say where you get them. And it should be a different place than talk to your boss, because you don't want it to appear that you are an expensive kind of a drag on the department because you're taking money from other things. That should be funded centrally. And so then making sure the technology tools and electronic documents and videos are accessible to people with disabilities. That we should be doing on all of our campuses, campus-wide. It's a journey. We'll probably never reach the destination of being perfect in this area, but we should continually work on it. And then online meetings. And I'll talk a little bit about those meetings guidelines. So here's the checklist we came up with in AccessADVANCE. And it's on our AccessADVANCE website, which I'll give you a URL for that a little bit later. And it talks about things more specifically. So recruitment, making sure those recruiting materials are accessible. So this is a document, a 4-page document that has these questions that can guide you. And you'll have different answers depending on your department or your program or your institution, but the things to think about. Do you omit irrelevant physical requirements from position announcements? That doesn't happen very often anymore, but I hear that it does in some cases. That should be true of all applications. Really thinking through, do they really need to be able to lift a 10-pound box or something for most jobs? Or is that something that could be a reasonable accommodation? Do you share how to request disability-related accommodations in that process, as I mentioned earlier, for the people who are applying? Policies and evaluation. Are new hires and other faculty made aware of the workplace accommodations process? And again, that can be in written materials. And some people will say to me, well, you should just, the person with disability should just ask for them. Well, they may not want to disclose their disability even to the department, frankly. They don't have to, but if they need, they could get accommodations. But it could be that they would choose not to tell the department because they can do everything that they need to do and so forth, just with an accommodation that's not real obvious and is nobody's business. It's a process clearly explained on faculty and public websites with examples of accommodations provided. This example part, several faculty members with disabilities have mentioned that, because every campus can determine what is a reasonable accommodation. And some faculty wish that was in the statement about accommodations, so they have a little better idea what type of accommodations that school offers. And do policies and procedures require that accessibility be considered in design, development, and procurement? That means kind of this universal design thing that everything you do, building a computer lab, building an engineering lab, creating some space, internal space with new furniture, all of those things should be considered. All of them, when considered, should include accessibility considerations. Are disability-related access issues addressed in evaluations of the department or of the school or whatever? Those are some things to think about. And the program or the campus culture. Do campus or program DEI initiatives address issues relevant to faculty members with disabilities, as I mentioned a little while ago, but also sometimes they'll ask about students with disabilities, but not faculty. Do you include disability issues on program campus climate surveys? Is it even on there? Some people are hesitant to put it on there because they think, well, that's kind of private information. So is the other demographic information that you have on your survey. If I don't want to disclose my gender, for example, I can usually leave that blank. And so the same can be true for disability, but it might be helpful to know if they have a disability when you're looking at their climate. You found that people with disabilities they find the climate quite negative, you might find in a case like that. You want to know that. Do policies and procedures move beyond compliance and accommodation for individuals to focus more on universal design? Kind of talked about universal design a few minutes ago. And then the physical environment. There are a lot of different things to think about. And is it easy to find the accessible routes of travel? I mentioned that one building here on campus, and then putting up signage and get them in through the right door and so forth. Our doors, do they have sensors or automatic opening buttons, particularly the main entrances and so forth? You might not be able to do that for every big door, but think about it. High contrast, large print directional signs and braille signage when appropriate. Sometimes signs, the print is so small, you have to be right up next to it to really read it. Make sure you have accessible elevator controls, well-marked wheelchair accessible restrooms, accessible emergency evacuation equipment, adjustable height tables and ergonomic chairs. In a large engineering lab, you might only have to have just a couple adjustable height tables. You're not going to have, probably in most schools, you're not going to have a lot of people in wheelchairs, but you might have one in that lab. And many tables are just too low for people using wheelchairs. And so allowing them to make it a little higher is a good thing. Are there policies and procedures to ensure that accessibility issues are addressed when facilities are constructed or remodeled, and when furniture and equipment are procured? And during those times, I recommend that you recruit some students with disabilities and have them help you with that. You can have them look around at the plans, at the space and so forth, and give you informal advice. If you do that, I also recommend that you pay them. Now, we've been doing that for years, and through the Do It program on our campus, we will pay them. We've been paying them $50 a piece, but with inflation, I think it's probably going to be 100 by the time we get back to campus and do it again. Think about support services. Do staff members know how to respond? Do we have a receptionist in your area? Do they know how to deal with people that come into the area who have disabilities and be able to discuss disability-related accommodations? That should be brought up. If they need a sign language interpreter, for example, they should know basics about how that might be arranged. They also need to know some protocol, and that if someone with a disability asks for an accommodation, don't say no unless you really know. Just listen and say, I'll have to get back with you on that, because maybe there are some accommodations you haven't been aware of. Are staff members aware of issues related to communicating with individuals of different races, ethnicities, ages, and abilities? Sometimes there's training on that kind of stuff, but the training doesn't include people with disabilities. For example, mentioning that someone uses a wheelchair is perfectly acceptable, but mentioning that it's a negative aspect that they are using a wheelchair, that they are bound, wheelchair bound. For example, it kind of gives you this image, for me anyway, the ropes around them to this wheelchair. And also the word even worse is confined, confined to a wheelchair. I've known a lot of people who use wheelchairs, and I've never met one that's confined by it. When you think about it, they're empowered by it. If you couldn't walk, you'd be very happy to get a wheelchair to get around. And so the wheelchair shouldn't be looked at as a negative thing. It's an assistive technology that's empowering. Are staff responsible for designing and developing websites? Knowledgeable about the web, accessible web design is important. You may not be that person, but do you have someone on staff that can do that for the technology you use? And then information resources in IT are important. Meetings, captions, recorded, posted online. Do web pages adhere to accessibility guidelines? Do publications include a statement about requesting disability related accommodations? And is it clear to how faculty can request guidance in choosing assistive technology? Sometimes, like on our campus, you can request accommodations one place, but we have an assistive technology unit and even a showroom of all this technology that's a benefit to you as well. And that should be in the guidelines that the faculty members get. And then our central funds available for accommodations. As I mentioned earlier, providing funding in the department may sound nice, But you can end up looking like you're kind of financial drain if all the money's coming out of the department. So I at least consider it to be a campus-wide responsibility, organization-wide responsibility. And so going up higher than that and let them pay for accommodations, because an accommodation for someone who's quadriplegic or someone using a wheelchair, otherwise disabled, some accommodations can be quite expensive. Most of them are not, but some are, and that might be an undue burden to a small unit. And as far as accommodations, which I consider to be part of universal design, if the universal design process didn't produce something accessible to a certain person, then you need to provide accommodations. And so does a simple, transparent procedure to ensure timely response to requests for disability accommodations exist? So besides just telling people the process, but if it doesn't seem to be very efficient, can you work with that office that provides accommodations and see if you can speed it up a bit? Are faculty made aware of these services? We already talked about that. All disabilities considered in the accommodations and initiatives around campus. Consider emphasizing the inclusion of non-apparent disabilities. That's where some people feel that there aren't accommodations. I was talking to a faculty member the other day, and I said, well, have you talked to the Disability Services Office? And well, no, but I said, they're the ones that do that. But where would they have learned that if they didn't just happen to talk to me? Our accommodations approved and funded centrally. That's another thing I already mentioned. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I'll give a quick little example of making something in a program more accessible and inclusive. And that's the universal design of meetings and events. You'll see a lot of overlap with what I've already said. And then we're gonna have some time for questions. And so be thinking of some questions you wanna ask. You can type them in chat and we'll deal with them at the end. But here's this example to think about. So you might be running a meeting or giving a presentation or something like I'm doing here today. Kind of think about who might have a barrier in participating at your event. People who are blind or visually impaired might have difficulty attending. If for a blind person, they wouldn't be able to see my screen here. And I've been very careful to speak all the content that's on the screen. I don't necessarily read it word for word, but as long as I verbalize it, then a person who's blind and can't see the screen, then they can follow the presentation. What they'd miss in this presentation are the nice little line drawings I have. There's one on the bottom of this page right now. We at the Do It program, you can see from our website, the Do It website, that we have under our resources, we have line drawings that we'll provide for free, give you permission to use in your brochures and things. They're all taken from pictures we have in our collection. But anyway, so I'm not describing those line drawings because I've decided as a speaker, and so it's my choice, that they're not essential to following this presentation. People who are deaf or hard of hearing, they may need the captions turned on. So it's important if you're doing Zoom that you have the caption capability turned on so they can turn those on for themselves. Also, it's important that they're publicizing your presentation that they know they can request a sign language interpreter and other accommodations. So some people much prefer a sign language interpreter or even a real-time captioner because it's more accurate for them, or they're more comfortable with that. Many people now are more comfortable with the captions like in Zoom because they're much better. The computer-generated captions are a lot better. They're better than YouTube right now on Zoom. And anyway, so some people who normally would get a live captioner will take Zoom captions. And the reason that I've talked to a few of them, the reason that they do that is because there's a little trade-off in that the computer might not understand what someone said and they miss a few words. But what they like is the almost immediate translation. When you have captions, computer-generated captions, compared to when you have to have a human being put in that information. So that's interesting. Attention or learning related disabilities. Sometimes a lot of clutter on the screen can be confusing to someone with attention deficit and some other learning disabilities. Mobility related disabilities. They can have problems with some of the technology you might be using, but not so much the PowerPoints and so forth. But they can have problems with technology that requires that they use a mouse, because some of them can't use the mouse, but they can use the keyboard with special assistive technology. English language learners, as I mentioned before, can benefit from captions and transcriptions. And then virtual or phone attendings, we might have a phone attendee is kind of like a person who's blind in my presentation. So I always describe things. It doesn't necessarily mean there's anyone in the group that's blind, but I like the idea they didn't have to ask. And usually they wouldn't ask for accommodation. They just live with whatever the result might be. But also some people that are attending virtually may not have much bandwidth, and so they want to turn those visuals off and just get the audio. So wheelchair accessible spaces. Now we're talking about spaces here. And so this is if you had something in person or hybrid. Clear aisles, they're nice and wide. Low tables for receptions and buffets. Accessible lecterns that are adequately lit. You ever get in a room and they've got the lectern and you have to have pretty much all the lights on in order for that to be lit. It isn't lit separately. I like to turn off many of the lights because it makes it easier for people to read PowerPoints. But it's hard to do sometimes, and that's a fault of the room it's in. And then accommodating food restrictions, of course. And then this space online, using accessible meeting software. Zoom is that, in part, a large part, because of units like mine that have worked with Zoom for many years, because we like to use them on our campuses and we like to make things accessible. Become familiar with the accessibility features of your software, like turning on those captions. Share relevant accessibility information with participants. So you might want to tell people who signed up that there will be automatic captions. And also you might want to give some particular features of Zoom on how to use the chat or something like that. So in preparation, share the accessibility guidelines with the presenters. As if you're running the program rather than just being the presenter. Make it clear how to request accommodations in your publicity. Know how to respond to requests for sign language and captioning and so forth. So again, don't just assume in captioning that the person is going to be satisfied with the computer generated ones. You know, how would you determine if it's reasonable not to provide the real-time captioning? Well, that would be determined in a court of law or by the Office of Civil Rights, frankly. So I can't answer that question. But I do know that at least some schools accept those requests for real-time captioning of a human being and sign language interpreters, and they will provide those. As far as online meetings, consider recording the meeting. Ensure that presenters are well lit. Encourage non-moving backgrounds. You know, little things moving around on the screen can be difficult for someone with attention issues and other disabilities. And then materials themselves, using a high contrast color scheme and large fonts. That's what I'm doing today. Keeping the text brief and the graphics simple. I'm doing that today. Use more than color coding to communicate information because people might be colorblind. And so if you have like two buttons and one's red and one's green, don't assume that they can tell the difference between those buttons. Maybe make one button square. Using captioned videos and sharing accessible versions of your agenda and presentations. So today I've sent or I posted up on the website my PowerPoints, and they're designed in an accessible way. And there are URLs and other things that you can gain there. But think about those printed materials you're giving. On our website, we have a lot of accessible documents, and then we also provide a PDF as a secondary version for people that might want to print it out. In delivering a presentation, incorporate a variety of instructional methods, kind of keep attention. I'm not doing a lot of that today because I don't have much time. Anyway, tell participants how they can engage. And so mention in chat, or is it okay to raise your hand, which it would be in my case too, or just speak. And then speaking the content of the slides, and use understandable terms. Really think about not using expressions that might be uncommon or jargon. If you do use them, make sure that you define them. Spelling out acronyms, that's a tough one to remember. And follow up, sharing the URLs and resources and so forth, and you'll get that on the PowerPoints. Gathering feedback about accessibility on the evaluation, and making adjustments for future meetings based on that feedback. So, and then even in evaluation, if you're asking for demographics, be sure to include disability. Some people have said, well, I don't want to include that because that's kind of personal and it should be optional. And so all the demographics should be optional in my book. I think that's optional stuff but you should ask them, because again, you might want to see if they're getting a poorer experience than other people. And in this particular example on the screen, it says prefer not to disclose. And so you can do that as well. It's also, you might want to consider them to describe their disability. I tend not to do this because the group is small enough. I'm not going to be able to really do much with that particular information, but you can find some standard lists of different types of disabilities, how you might want to organize it. And there's a list here if you look at the PowerPoints you can think about. So I'll just kind of end with how you might engage with the advanced program if that kind of interests you. And so, well, there we have some capacity building institutes and they're online now. You can attend some of our webinars, apply for a mini grant. We'll provide funding to make something more accessible. And review project products that we have are coming up. And so you can send email to doit@uw.edu. That's our do it address, and ask to join our AccessADVANCE community of practice. If you want to be with people that are thinking about how we can make faculty positions more inclusive of people with disabilities, particularly women. It's a nice, cheerful group, and we come up with some great ideas and create videos and publications to promote this agenda. So you'll find on the PowerPoints URL for the Center on Universal Design and Education I mentioned, also the AccessADVANCE project. And again, my email address is sherylb@uw.edu. Also on the screen is my newest book, which is called Creating Inclusive Learning Opportunities in Higher Education, a Universal Design Toolkit. So we'll start there and see if we have any questions or comments in chat. So has anything popped up, or we all done for the day here?
Going through, let's see, don't see any one new message. Okay, Jessica said, thank you, it's been a great session. Shar, how do we get faculty/instructors to feel comfortable asking for accommodations?
Oh, that's a tough one. You know, I think that's a multi-pronged thing, but that's the same thing we run into even with students. And I think that some of the suggestions here where disability comes up all the time, when you're talking about diversity, when you look in the faculty handbook, I think that's the best way. Also, the other thing that's critical is when they talk about, when they ask for an accommodation, they don't have to go to their boss or someone else in their department. They're going to this other sort of anonymous unit. And they can even be anonymous when they talk to them if they don't want to reveal their identity until they get an accommodation. But I think that's the best way, to just have it more common, that it just appears in everything that we do. If you're planning an event, if you need a disability related accommodation, please have the email address in the documents for faculty and so forth, right back to the application process, where and you make it accessible and you document that. You say this is accessible, but if you still find a barrier to applying for this job, please contact and have very specific contact. That again is not the boss that you'll have. Well, I think our time's up here, just about. We could entertain one more question. Do you have an evaluation that they need to do?
Yep, I'll put that in, but there's one more question. Should the accessibility contact be in HR?
What about it?
The accessibility contact, should it be in human resources?
Oh, should it be in HR? I think so. That's the way most campuses are doing it. You know, the contact for disability services for students is generally in the student services organization. And so it should be in kind of a faculty organization, and HR, I think, is a pretty good place for that, because there isn't usually anything else as general as far as reaching faculty and employees, and HR does serve employees and faculty. And so I think it's a logical place. But it's really good for those disability services groups, the one for students and the one for faculty, to work together. Like on our campus, the disability services group for faculty and employees, they do all the coordination of sign language interpreters. And so the disability services for students, they'll work with them. That way you're not competing with one another. Again, that sign language interpreter, you know, And then there are other things that they both have to do, but they'll let one group do it.
Yep. That's a good point. And Patty says, I think high-level leadership promoting the availability of accommodations goes a long way.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, Cheryl, I have a question that's just a little bit related. You always have these really nice line drawings on your slides. Where do you get those?
We make them.
You make them. Okay.
Yes.
That's what I
And if
was
you go to the
thinking.
Do It website
Uh-huh.
and you talk, and it says, there's a button on the top that says resources, you will get, there's an item toward the bottom that's on free line drawings. We even have some pictures and stickers, but these little buttons. And most of them have been drawn by a person who has muscular dystrophy, so she has accommodations for actually doing that. And she picked up this thing she was learning about line writing, doing line drawings. And so we actually hired her, and she's kind of learning along the way too. But all those pictures are Do It pictures. So they've been real people. I'm even in there in a few cases, but nobody else but me would probably notice. But yeah, it's I've always liked the line drawings because they're not as bulky as the picture, and they don't go out of date.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So
perfect.
Yeah.
Check those out.
I hear that there's at least one place on campus, so there are probably a dozen, but that will take a picture and turn it into a line drawing.
Oh.
But I've been told they don't do as good a job as this person we have that does ours, but I think they're probably at about 50 of them up there. So yeah, look at the Do It website, uw.edu/DOIT.
Perfect.
And they're free.
Love it.
Just give us some credit.
Will do.
Tells you what to write underneath them.
Perfect.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me join you today. Have a good conference.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks,
you're
everyone.
welcome.